A company in Hong Kong agreed to buy a flat for 4.2 million Hong Kong dollars. The contract was signed, the deposit was paid, the purchase money was ready. And on the final day, a messenger arrived carrying the checks and the exact solicitor's undertaking needed to complete the deal. He arrived at 5:10 in the afternoon. The deadline was 5 o'clock. 10 minutes. That was the entire gap between the buyer and the flat. But buried in the agreement was wording that made those 10 minutes much more than an ordinary delay. The seller rejected the money, cancelled the sale, and kept the deposit of 420,000 Hong Kong dollars. And the buyer would spend the next 5 years trying to convince the courts that 5:10 should still be close enough. The story began on the 1st of August 1991. Union Eagle Limited agreed to purchase a flat on Hong Kong Island from Golden Achievement Limited. The price was 4.2 million Hong Kong dollars, and Union Eagle paid 10% up front. That deposit was not small, it was 420,000 Hong Kong dollars. At this point, the transaction looked completely normal. A written sale agreement, a deposit held by the seller's solicitors, a future date when the remaining money would be handed over and the property documents would move in the other direction. But the completion section did not merely say the deal should finish on the 30th of September. It said completion had to take place on or before that date, and before 5 p.m. Then the contract made the deadline even harder. Time was to be, in every respect, of the essence. In ordinary language, 5 o'clock was not an estimate, a target, or the time everyone hoped to finish. It was one of the essential terms of the bargain. And Clause 12 explained what could happen if the purchaser failed to comply. The deposit and any part of the purchase price already paid could be forfeited, and the vendor could rescind the agreement. Rescind sounds technical, but here it meant the seller could end the deal, keep the deposit, retain the flat, and become free to sell it again. So the buyer did not simply have a completion date, it had a contractual cliff. The 30th of September arrived, and the problems began before the clock was anywhere near 5. Union Eagle missed a morning appointment to inspect the flat. The judgment does not explain why, so there is no responsible way to fill that gap with a dramatic excuse. What the public record does show is that shortly before noon, Miss Chow, a conveyancing clerk working with the vendor's solicitors, telephoned Miss Tin at the purchaser's solicitors. The warning was direct. The balance had to be paid by 5 p.m, or the vendor would exercise its right to rescind the contract and forfeit the deposit. This matters because the deadline did not sneak up on the buyer unnoticed. The seller's side pointed at it on the day itself. Miss Tin called back and confirmed that her client would complete according to the contract. Then 5 o'clock arrived. The money did not. At 5:01, Miss Chow called again. She said the funds had not arrived and the vendor reserved its right to rescind and keep the deposit. The response was that a messenger was on his way. 9 minutes later, he reached the vendor's solicitors. Inside his envelope were checks for the purchase money and a solicitor's letter of undertaking in a form the parties had already agreed. The buyer was ready to finish, just not by the time written in the contract. The seller's solicitor called his client for instructions. The answer was to rescind. At 5:11, 1 minute after the messenger arrived, Miss Chow called the purchaser's solicitors and said the contract would be cancelled. The envelope and everything inside it were handed back. That is how quickly the deal moved from almost complete to over. Union Eagle refused to accept that a 10-minute delay should cost it the flat and its deposit. It went to court asking for specific performance. That phrase is important. Union Eagle was not merely asking for compensation, it wanted an order forcing Golden Achievement to complete the original sale and transfer the flat. And its first argument sounded, at least on the surface, quite logical. A serious contractual breach does not always make a contract vanish automatically. Normally, the innocent party must accept the breach and bring the agreement to an end. Union Eagle argued that when the messenger arrived at 5:10, the vendor had not yet completed that process. So the contract was still alive, the buyer was tendering full performance, and the seller should have accepted it. One judge in Hong Kong's Court of Appeal found that argument persuasive, but the Privy Council did not. Its answer was that after 5 p.m, Union Eagle could no longer perform the contract according to its actual terms. The agreement required payment before 5. A payment at 5:10 was not the same performance delivered slightly later. It was performance on different timing from the timing promised. The seller could be forced to accept that only if it had waived the deadline or if its own conduct prevented it from relying on the deadline. Nothing in the facts established that. The buyer then tried another route. There was an argument that the vendor's clerk may have opened or examined the messenger's envelope before returning it. Could that count as accepting the late completion or confirming that the contract continued? The court rejected that too. Even if the envelope had been opened, everything said and done by the seller's side showed that the late tender was being rejected, not accepted. Then came the deposit. Clause 12 described the money as liquidated damages and said it was not a penalty. Union Eagle argued that this wording opened the door to treating the deposit of 420,000 Hong Kong dollars as an unenforceable penalty. But the court said the wording did not change the money's basic character. It was still a conventional 10% deposit, an upfront sign that the purchaser was committed to completing the bargain. When the seller validly rescinded, the deposit could be forfeited. That left the biggest argument of all: fairness. The buyer was not 10 days late. It was not even 10 hours late. The full tender appeared 10 minutes after the deadline, so Union Eagle asked the court to use its equitable power. Equity is the part of the legal system that can sometimes stop an extremely rigid legal result when enforcing it would be unconscionable. The basic pitch was simple. The buyer was ready, the delay was tiny, and losing the entire property deal was wildly disproportionate. In the Court of Appeal, the dissenting judge said the case cried out for equity to intervene. The Privy Council looked at the same facts and reached almost the opposite conclusion. To understand why, look at the seller's position after 5 o'clock. If courts could revive a transaction, whenever the delay seemed small, the seller could never be certain that the contract had really ended. 10 minutes might be excused, then someone would ask about an hour, then a day. Every case would turn into a new argument over how late was too late. And during that argument, the property could be stuck. That is exactly what happened here. For roughly 5 years, Golden Achievement did not know with certainty whether it was free to resell the flat. A caution connected to the litigation effectively sterilised the property while the case moved through the courts. The judges said commercial parties need to know that when a contract clearly states what will happen after a specific event, those consequences will normally be enforced. Otherwise, even the possibility of discretionary relief can create years of uncertainty and give litigation value as a negotiating weapon. There can be exceptional cases. A seller might contribute to the buyer's delay, a purchaser might have spent heavily improving land, a transaction might really operate like a secured loan rather than an ordinary sale, a forfeited payment might be an unlawful penalty. But the Privy Council said none of those features existed here. The seller had warned the buyer before noon. It warned the buyer again at 5:01. There was no finding that the seller caused the delay. Union Eagle had not built on or improved the flat, and the 10% payment remained an ordinary deposit. The High Court had already dismissed the buyer's case in April 1995. A 2-1 majority of Hong Kong's Court of Appeal upheld that result in November of the same year. Then, on the 3rd of February 1997, the Privy Council dismissed Union Eagle's final appeal. Golden Achievement was not forced to sell the flat. The deposit of 420,000 Hong Kong dollars remained forfeited. Union Eagle was also ordered to pay the costs of the final appeal. The result feels harsh because nothing physical changed during those 10 minutes. The flat was still there. The money still arrived. The documents were ready. But the court's point was that something had changed. The deadline had passed, and once the agreement made that exact time essential, 5:10 was not almost 5 o'clock. It was the other side of the contract.